Mueller's work is done, and yet the other thing we learn in this report is that several big, interesting investigations are ongoing. The report identifying 14 referrals to other offices, Michael Cohen and former Obama White House counsel Greg Craig, the only ones that are actually revealed. The question of obstruction remains open, as the Mueller report is explicit that it's up to Congress to potentially decide what matters should be dealt with when it comes to a sitting president. Quote, with respect to whether the president can be found to have obstructed justice, we concluded that the Congress has the authority to prohibit a president's corrupt use of his authority in order to protect the integrity of the administration of justice. Translation, the defense that you've heard from the likes of Barr and that you've heard from the likes of Rudy Giuliani, that obstruction itself is actually impossible. Mueller, again, if you think he acts deliberately, he chose to put in writing what we have tonight for the first time ever. He completely disagrees, and he shows his work why. With that in mind, I turn now first to U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, who serves on the Judiciary Committee. And after we speak in a little bit of a colloquy, we will add in Bob Mueller's former Chief of Staff, John Carlin. First of all, Senator, on a busy night, thanks for coming on The Beat.
Thank you.
When you look at that, what is Mueller trying to say in your view, and did Mr. Barr handle this properly?
Mueller is trying to say to Congress, you should do your job, hold the president accountable, because I have given you a sweeping, systematic story of criminal wrongdoing. And where I part ways with Mueller, perhaps, and I want to ask him about it when he comes before the Senate Judiciary Committee, is the decision not to subpoena the president. I understand it may have taken additional time, but I think that those answers, the I don't recalls, go directly to criminal intent, which can be established only if there is a give and take of questioning. And second,
doesn't that go, though, to whether there was a pattern of obstruction? Because the obstruction section is really about two things. Donald Trump trying to do things that his own aides were so outraged and concerned over that they tried to save Trump from himself. That's why we have some of this colorful language of Saturday Night Massacres and saving him from crazy expletive. Then you have all of the documented actions that are obstruction crimes. Many of those people were advisors to Trump. And so that starts to close the circle. For your rebuttal, you know, we talk to everyone that we can on these stories. And I was able to interview the president's attorney, Jay Sekulow, about this today and about those obstruction convictions of Trump aides and whether they say that is a problem. And do they call for that type of activity to stop? Take a look at what Jay Sekulow told us here today after the report came out. Mueller finds these lies. I read you the quote. Do you accept that finding? And if so, does the president condemn those lies that interfered with his own Justice Department's investigation?
Look, I mean, I'm not. I know which ones I believe you're talking about. The president doesn't support anyone telling lies. So let's be crystal clear on that.
Your response, Senator.
The report documents in detail how the president not only tolerated and condoned people lying, but he encouraged and instructed them to lie. Take Don McGahn. He asked Don McGahn to fire the special counsel. Don McGahn agonized and decided he had to resign and didn't do it. Then he asked Don McGahn to put a document in the file saying he never asked Don McGahn to do it.
Yeah, that was, that was really striking. We haven't discussed that on air yet. We're half an hour into the beat. This report shows the persistence of Donald Trump's, what the report calls evidence of obstruction, what other people call potentially crimes of obstruction. The notion that he tells McGahn to do something that he seemed to have the knowledge would be potentially unlawful. Fire Mueller. McGahn threatens to resign over it, starts packing his luggage. It's all in there in great detail. And then he says to McGahn, falsify the records and say, I never did this. What does that tell you?
That tells me he has knowledge that what he asked McGahn to do was potentially illegal. Take another example, and this one, to my knowledge, hasn't been mentioned. There is a section on K.T. McFarland, the president's deputy national security advisor. He told her she had to leave, but he would make her ambassador to Singapore if only she put in the file a document saying he never asked Michael Flynn to contact the Russian ambassador, Kislyak. An inducement, in effect, to lie. Again, putting a false document in the record.
So you're in the upper body, the Senate, which when these issues get to the level of whether the president, as a sitting president, has committed a high crime, you would ultimately adjudicate that. You have the Senate trial if or when in any administration you get to that. But this starts in the House. What do you think the House Judiciary Committee should do, or is it too early to say?
Well, let's take this full report, which we're all still reading, and which I want to read several times more. It is not only a sweeping indictment in all but name on obstruction.
Obstruction, yeah.
But it is also a portrait of deeply unacceptable, unethical conduct, unbefitting an American president.
And so as you list out, that is your understanding of what Mueller has documented. I turn to Bob Mueller's chief of staff to try to understand. First of all, yes or no, did Attorney General Barr do a disservice to what Mueller actually did in this report?
I was very disappointed by the press conference today, and now having read the report. There were a couple statements, including several times saying there was no evidence of this conduct or that conduct. When one reads the report, there is voluminous, substantial evidence. And instead, the Mueller report was careful when it comes to evidence of conspiracy to say this evidence doesn't rise to the level of being admissible and provable beyond a reasonable doubt. Any lawyer knows that's different than no evidence. And then similarly with obstruction, what he said was quite different. There he said and laid out there's substantial evidence essentially of obstruction, but I don't think it's my job to determine whether or not this evidence meets the criminal definition of obstruction, which leads to only two remedies. One is for the senator in his role, so the Senate and the House, to determine what this conduct is, and the other would be for it to be considered after the president has left office for potential criminal charges.
So, John, you as chief of staff to Bob Mueller are someone I've been waiting to talk to. For the benefit of the audience, because what's different about tonight is the amount of evidence and information we have, not the partial sentences, not the spin. I'm going to go ahead and read you the entire conclusion and see what you think you can tell us Mueller means by it. Because we determined not to make a traditional prosecutorial judgment, we did not draw ultimate conclusions about the president's conduct. The evidence we obtained about the actions and intent of the president present difficult issues that would need to be resolved if we were making a traditional prosecutorial judgment. If we had confidence after this thorough investigation that President Trump did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and legal standards, we're unable to reach that judgment, he says, because the rules prevent it. So while this report does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. Do you read that as a jump ball or an implication that there's evidence of obstruction and they just aren't allowed to go any further than that?
The latter, that there's substantial evidence of obstruction, but that they believe it is not within their remit to make the conclusion as to whether or not that rises to an indictable crime.
So here's the hard follow-up question for you, and then back to the senator. I know you're loath to say anything that criticizes your old boss, and I know you hold him as a man of integrity, as so many experts we've spoken to do. Why didn't he go further and add a single sentence after that made it clearer to the public who he knew would read some of this, to the Congress, which is not only made up of lawyers, our former federal prosecutor, senator notwithstanding, and say in plain English whether this was leaning towards the crime of obstruction or not? Because while I could read it your way, what you just said, and I've heard experts say that today, would you agree that Bob Mueller didn't actually drop the hammer in plain English that way, which leaves a lot of room for people to argue in good or bad faith, hey, it doesn't say that Trump committed obstruction?
I think he means what he says when he says he thinks it would be unfair if there's no remedy for a defendant to be able to present their side of a case, for a prosecutor to render a judgment that says someone's committed obstruction of justice. But you asked, should he have added a sentence? He did. He added pages after pages of evidence, meticulously laying out in shocking
but I'm going to push
detail.
you, John. I think you make very fair points, but at the end of the day, this is the end. This is the conclusion. Now, if it were really good in the full paragraph, Mr. Barr might have quoted the full paragraph. He didn't. He quoted a partial sentence. You have a fair point. But Bob Mueller, did he stick the landing in plain English for people to understand what he meant?
I think he thought it was unfair for him to reach that conclusion. So what he did was provide the facts to us to read. It's hard for, I know everyone, particularly in a fast news cycle, to do that, but now it's incumbent upon us as citizens and as legislators.
Fast news cycle.
to read
We got
the facts.
time. I've been reading this all day. Let me go to the senator who looks like he wants to get it, and then Councilor Wiley.
Let me just make a point here about the collusion charge, as well as by the need for congressional oversight. What we have here is Donald Trump welcoming, accepting, happily taking help from a foreign adversary in his campaign that involves clear illegality, hacking into a government computer, hacking into the computers of his opponent and the DNC. And whether there was that explicit meeting of the minds that we all know as lawyers at this table is necessary for a conspiracy, there clearly was a threat to the United States of America that continues. And Donald Trump continues to say he believes Vladimir Putin instead of our intelligence community. I sit on the Armed Services Committee, not just the Judiciary Committee. I'm concerned as a United States Senator and as a citizen that the Russians are at it again. They're going to do it in the 2020 election because Attorney General Barr and Donald Trump have given them a pass in effect.
So I've never met John before, but I'm going to be his anger interpreter right now. I'm going to do
A Key and Peele reference.
because I think the answer to the question
You're going to be his
asking,
anger translator.
I'm going to be his anger translator.
Let's hear it.
Hell no. He did not stick that landing, but for the reasons he made very clear. I mean, Bob Mueller was very transparent about why he wasn't sticking the landing, which is to say he thought it would be unfair to the president. I think when we also look at what Bob Mueller says, part of why he couldn't establish evidence of conspiracy is because people were lying to him. It's because Donald Trump would not come be interviewed.
But I think you're splitting the two issues together.
I
Right. One is Mr. Carlin, who chiefs of staff often are made in their boss's image, and we have two very careful, thoughtful attorneys here, essentially. But is that, in this day and age, against what is laid out here, rats, crazy S, I'm effed, all this stuff in there, is that not enough for this political process, which does involve the Congress? That's question one. Question two is, what were they all lying about if there was nothing to hide?
Right. Yes. Okay, that was me being, I wasn't being your anger interpreter there. So
You can be mine.
I can, okay. Well, so first of all, I think you have to read these two pieces together, these two volumes together. What is he obstructing for?
Yeah.
He's obstructing for a reason, and that's what the first volume is speaking to, right? Which is all this activity that's going on. There is evidence in the first volume. Whether it rises to the level of a criminal prosecution doesn't mean there's not evidence, but that goes to the point about obstruction, and that's why absolutely Congress has enough here.
And this is the fundamental flaw in Bill Barr's analysis. Bill Barr seems to suggest that because Volume 1 doesn't come to a clear conclusion about conspiracy or collusion with the Russians, there can be no obstruction of justice. And that's just not true. Like, there can be obstruction even if it's actually not successful and even if there isn't the underlying successful
Well, and that goes to Mueller's inclusion of the president, finding out, oh, there's going to be an investigation. This is, quote, the end of my presidency. My supposition here is that Mueller didn't put that in there for tabloid headlines. He has avoided headlines for 23 months. I think he put it in there as a clue of what they uncovered narratively, which is that when Donald Trump understood that there would be an actual assertive investigation, it posed legal peril for him. Maybe not on election conspiracy. Maybe it was on the 2016 crimes in New York that Michael Cohen confessed to. Maybe it was on other crimes that have not been uncovered. Maybe it was on one of the 12 criminal referrals. But I don't think we heard my presidency is over, I'm effed today in this report as a cheap shot. Everything we know is it's not a cheap shot. It goes to the president's state of mind. I'm overdue for my next guest, but I give you a final word because you look like you want one.
Well, I think it goes back to this whole question. I mean, you see throughout this report all of these details on people telling Michael Flynn, you know, you are loved, the president loves you, you have friends in high places. This is not normal procedure in a working, functional White House. This is like Breaking Bad and Saul or a Mario Puzo novel. I mean, this is not ordinarily how White House counsel function and how the counsel for the president would function. This is completely unorthodox.
And wasn't it in Breaking Bad that they said, don't get high on your own supply? Melissa Murray, Maya Wiley, former Chief of Staff to Bob Mueller, John Carlin, and U.S. Senator Richard Blumenthal. My thanks to each of you. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.